Warning: do not watch this video alone at night. When Captain Lucian Frost activated an ancient beacon near Orion's star, he unleashed something that should have remained buried. Demonic entities from another dimension are now hunting his crew across space and time. Can they escape before the portal opens permanently? Subscribe now to uncover the chilling truth behind the Orion legend. The stars outside the viewport shimmered like scattered diamonds against the velvet blackness of space. Captain Lucian Frost leaned back in his command chair, watching as the automated systems monitored their progress through the designated survey zone near Orion's belt. The ship hummed softly around him, its sophisticated AI maintaining perfect course adjustments while his small crew performed their respective duties. It had been a routine patrol assignment, one of many in their long service record. But something about this sector felt different, though Frost couldn't quite put his finger on it. Perhaps it was the way the stars seemed to dance just beyond the range of their instruments, or how the ship's sensors occasionally flickered without explanation. He glanced at the chronometer. They'd been in this region for nearly 12 hours now, and nothing unusual had occurred. Yet his instincts, honed by years of deep space exploration, whispered warnings in the back of his mind. The ship's AI, known as Echo 7, chimed softly. "Captain, I am detecting minor fluctuations in subspace energy," it reported in its calm, synthetic voice. Frost frowned, leaning forward to examine the data scrolling across his personal interface. Subspace anomalies were rare, but not unheard of, especially this close to such a dense cluster of stars. Still, the timing felt off. They had entered this region precisely according to protocol, and no previous missions had flagged any significant issues here. Frost tapped his comm unit. "Riley, anything unusual on your end?" he asked, addressing his navigator. Riley Stone's voice crackled through the speaker. "Negative, Captain. Everything checks out within normal parameters." There was a brief pause before she added, "Though, I've been cross-referencing our position with some older stellar charts. This area has a lot of gaps in historical records. Almost like someone didn't want anyone looking too closely." Frost's frown deepened. Riley had always been fascinated by ancient myths and legends surrounding Orion, particularly the tales of an interdimensional gateway hidden somewhere within its constellation. Most dismissed them as mere superstition, but Riley had uncovered references to these myths across multiple civilizations throughout history. Her curiosity often led her down rabbit holes of research, sometimes yielding useful insights, other times nothing more than speculative theories. Thomas Weir, the ship's chief engineer, poked his head into the bridge from the adjacent engineering bay. "You know what they say about old maps," he quipped, wiping grease-stained hands on his coveralls. "They're either treasure troves or wild goose chases." Despite his casual tone, there was a glint of concern in his eyes. Thomas had spent years studying quantum mechanics and propulsion systems, and he understood better than most how fragile the fabric of reality could be under certain conditions. If there was even a kernel of truth to Riley's findings, they might already be treading dangerous ground. Frost turned back to the viewport, his gaze lingering on the swirling nebulae that framed Orion's belt. For centuries, humanity had stared up at those stars, weaving stories and legends around their brilliance. Now, sitting here in the cold silence of space, surrounded by the hum of advanced technology, those same legends felt closer than ever, almost tangible. "Keep me posted if anything changes," he instructed, standing up to stretch his legs. As he paced the length of the bridge, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. It wasn't paranoia, it was something deeper, primal. Like the universe itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what they would do next. Riley Stone's fingers danced across the holographic interface of her navigation console, cross-referencing their position with ancient stellar maps archived in the ship's database. She had always been fascinated by the legends surrounding Orion, particularly the tales of an interdimensional gateway hidden within its constellation. Most dismissed them as mere superstition, but Riley had uncovered references to these myths across multiple civilizations throughout history. As she adjusted the quantum scanners, attempting to penetrate deeper into subspace frequencies, her display suddenly flared with an unexpected energy signature. Something massive and ancient was pulsing, just beyond their detection threshold. Her heart quickened as she recalled fragmented texts describing similar readings near other legendary gateways. Before she could alert the captain, the ship shuddered violently, throwing her against her station. Alarms blared throughout the vessel as emergency lights bathed the bridge in crimson. What the hell was that? Thomas demanded, rushing onto the bridge with a diagnostic tablet in hand. His dark eyes scanned the chaos unfolding around them, his expression shifting from confusion to alarm. The ship's systems were acting erratically, panels sparking and screens glitching with static. Riley scrambled to stabilize her console, her fingers flying over the controls. "I don't know," she shouted over the din. It came out of nowhere, an energy spike unlike anything I've ever seen. "It's interfering with our navigation systems." Captain Frost appeared moments later, his authoritative presence cutting through the panic. "Status report," he barked, striding toward the central command console. Riley quickly pulled up the sensor data, projecting it onto the main view screen. What they saw made everyone freeze. A swirling vortex of light and shadow had formed just ahead of the ship, distorting the stars behind it into impossible shapes. The phenomenon pulsed rhythmically, almost like a heartbeat, radiating waves of energy that caused the ship's hull to groan under the strain. "We're caught in some kind of gravitational well," Riley explained, her voice tight with tension. "But it's not natural. None of the physics models are making sense here." She highlighted several key readings on the display, pointing out anomalies that defied conventional understanding. Quantum fluctuations were spiking unpredictably, and localized gravity fields were fluctuating wildly. "It's like we've triggered something ancient." Thomas cursed under his breath as he reviewed the diagnostic feed from engineering. "Our power grid is destabilizing," he said grimly. "Whatever this thing is, it's siphoning energy directly from our core. If we don't stabilize soon, we risk total system failure." He tapped furiously at his tablet, rerouting auxiliary power to critical systems in an attempt to buy them time. But even as he worked, the ship shook again, harder this time, sending loose equipment tumbling across the floor. Frost gripped the edge of the command console, his knuckles white. "Options?" he asked tersely, scanning the faces of his crew. Both Riley and Thomas hesitated, their expressions mirroring the uncertainty they all felt. They were venturing into uncharted territory, facing a threat none of them had prepared for. The legends Riley had studied spoke of dire consequences for those who disturbed Orion's secrets, but they had always seemed like cautionary tales, warnings meant to keep people away rather than literal truths. Then, as if responding to their fear, the vortex began to shift. Dark tendrils snaked outward, probing the edges of the ship like living things. Riley gasped as one of them brushed against the hull, triggering another wave of interference. "It's testing us," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the alarms. "Like it knows we're here." Frost clenched his jaw, determination hardening his features. "Echo 7, he called out, addressing the ship's AI. "Initiate emergency protocols. Seal all bulkheads and prepare for possible evacuation." The AI acknowledged immediately, its synthetic voice calm despite the escalating crisis. Red warning lights flashed as sections of the ship locked down automatically, isolating critical areas from potential breaches. But even as they took defensive measures, the situation worsened. The air grew heavy, charged with an unnatural energy that made the hair on their arms stand on end. Shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally along the walls, twisting into forms that shouldn't exist. Riley's console flickered again, this time displaying symbols she didn't recognize, glyphs etched in glowing lines that pulsed in sync with the vortex outside. "These weren't here before," she muttered, zooming in on the strange markings. "They're appearing everywhere." Thomas moved closer, his brow furrowed. "That's not just interference," he said slowly. "Those patterns, they're deliberate. Someone or something is communicating with us." His words hung in the air, chilling the room further. Whatever force they had awakened, it was intelligent. And it was far more powerful than they had anticipated. Thomas were cursed under his breath as he scrambled through the maintenance tunnels, his engineering scanner vibrating urgently in his hand. The power fluctuations rippling through the ship's systems defied every technical manual he'd ever studied. Energy patterns that shouldn't exist were bleeding through dimensional barriers, causing catastrophic feedback loops in their quantum circuits. His hands moved swiftly over control panels, rerouting power and attempting to stabilize critical systems while trying to understand what they were dealing with. In the engine room, he discovered glowing symbols etched into the bulkheads, markings that hadn't been there when they began their patrol. They pulsed in sync with the ship's deteriorating shields, each flash bringing them closer to total system failure. As he recorded detailed scans, his scientific mind struggled to comprehend how conventional physics could explain these phenomena. The air grew heavier, charged with an unnatural energy that made his skin crawl. The symbols spread faster than he could document them, appearing on every surface of the ship. At first glance, they resembled circuit diagrams, but closer inspection revealed intricate patterns that seemed alive, shifting and rearranging themselves as if adapting to the ship's declining condition. Thomas snapped photos with his scanner, hoping to analyze them later if there was a later. For now, his priority was keeping the ship operational. Echo 7, he called out, addressing the AI. Run a full diagnostic on these symbols. Cross-reference them with any known languages or coding structures. The AI responded almost instantly. Symbols do not match any documented linguistic or technological databases, it reported. However, their frequency patterns correlate with subspace energy signatures detected earlier. Thomas swore again, his frustration mounting. Without a frame of reference, he was essentially working blind. Every attempt to counteract the energy bleed resulted in new anomalies, forcing him to constantly adapt his strategies. The ship's quantum drive, the very heart of their propulsion system, was beginning to destabilize, threatening to collapse entirely. He climbed down into the lower deck, where access panels lined the walls. Here, the symbols were denser, forming complex webs that covered entire sections of the ceiling and floor. As he examined them, he noticed something peculiar. The patterns weren't random. They followed specific geometries, repeating motifs that hinted at purposeful design. This isn't interference, he muttered to himself. It's a message. But who or what was sending it? Back in the engine room, Thomas activated a portable containment field generator, hoping to isolate the worst affected areas. The device hummed to life, creating a translucent barrier around the glowing glyphs. For a moment, the symbols dimmed, as if reacting to the artificial field. Encouraged, Thomas adjusted the settings, increasing the field's intensity. The symbols flared brightly in response, then abruptly vanished, leaving behind scorched marks on the metal walls. Interesting, he murmured, jotting notes on his tablet. Whatever these things were, they could be manipulated, but only temporarily. Meanwhile, the rest of the ship continued to deteriorate. Bulkheads groaned under impossible stresses, and temperature fluctuations became more extreme. In some areas, ice formed rapidly on exposed surfaces, only to sublimate into vapor seconds later. The combination of heat and cold created bizarre condensation effects, making it seem as though the ship itself was breathing. Thomas paused, listening to the eerie creaks and pops echoing through the corridors. He couldn't shake the feeling that the ship was alive, that it had somehow become part of whatever entity they had awakened. As he worked, he kept one eye on the diagnostic feed streaming from engineering. Power reserves were dropping dangerously low, and backup systems were failing faster than he could repair them. He considered shutting down non-essential functions altogether, but doing so might leave them vulnerable to whatever was pressing against the dimensional barrier. The decision weighed heavily on him, a reminder of the immense responsibility resting on his shoulders. One wrong move, and they'd all be lost. Thomas. Riley's voice crackled over the comms. We need you on the bridge. Something's happening with the vortex. He grabbed his toolkit and sprinted toward the nearest ladder, his boots clanging against the metal rungs. By the time he reached the upper deck, the ship was shaking violently, throwing him off balance. He steadied himself against the wall, catching glimpses of shadowy figures moving just beyond the viewport. Whatever they were dealing with, it was getting closer. Captain Frost's voice cut through the chaos like a blade, commanding immediate attention despite the escalating crisis. "All hands, report to the bridge immediately," he barked, his tone leaving no room for delay. As his crew assembled, he initiated an emergency transmission to Fleet Command, only to find all communication channels blocked by an impenetrable interference pattern. The view screen displayed impossible geometries swirling where stars should have been, a kaleidoscope of colors and shapes that hurt to look at directly. "We're not alone here," Frost stated grimly, his eyes fixed on the swirling vortex that seemed to grow larger with each passing second. Through the transparent aluminum viewport, shadowy forms began to take shape, their movements suggesting intelligence rather than random cosmic phenomena. The temperature plummeted as an unnatural darkness spread across the ship, extinguishing lights and draining power reserves at an alarming rate. Frost stood at the center of the bridge, his posture rigid with authority despite the growing unease among his crew. He gestured sharply at Riley, who was frantically adjusting the sensor arrays in a desperate attempt to restore communications. "What's the status on our signal?" he demanded, his voice cutting through the cacophony of alarms and mechanical groans. Riley shook her head, her fingers flying over the holographic interface. "No luck, Captain. Something's actively jamming us. It's like the vortex is swallowing our transmissions whole." She paused, her eyes widening as new data scrolled across her screen. "And it's getting worse. The interference is spreading, affecting everything from life support to navigation." Thomas joined them, his face pale beneath the harsh red emergency lighting. "Captain, you need to see this," he said, pulling up a series of diagnostic readings on the main view screen. The ship's structural integrity was failing at an accelerating rate, with stress fractures appearing in key sections of the hull. Worse still, the glowing symbols that had infested the lower decks were now spreading upward, consuming entire corridors and compartments. "These aren't just random patterns anymore," Thomas continued, his voice trembling slightly. "They're coordinating. It's like the ship itself is being rewritten, reprogrammed, from the inside out." Frost's jaw tightened as he processed the information. Their situation was spiraling out of control, and every solution they attempted only seemed to make things worse. Outside the viewport, the shadowy forms grew more distinct, resolving into grotesque, humanoid shapes that twisted and writhed in ways that defied logic. Their eyes glowed with malevolent light, and their mouths opened impossibly wide, emitting silent screams that resonated in the minds of everyone aboard. Frost felt a chill run down his spine as he realized they were being observed, not just physically, but mentally. These entities weren't merely external threats, they were probing their thoughts, searching for weaknesses. "Seal off all non-essential areas," Frost ordered, turning to address the entire crew. "Divert all available power to shields and life support. We need to buy ourselves time." His words carried weight, but there was no mistaking the tension in his voice. Even he, with decades of experience navigating the unknown reaches of space, had never encountered anything like this. The legends Riley had mentioned earlier suddenly seemed less like myths and more like warnings written in blood. As the crew scrambled to execute his orders, Frost approached the viewport, staring directly into the maelstrom of light and shadow. The vortex pulsed steadily, its rhythm matching the pounding in his chest. He could feel it now, a presence, vast and ancient, lurking just beyond the veil of reality. It wasn't simply trying to destroy them, it was testing them, gauging their resolve. Frost clenched his fists, his mind racing through possibilities. If they were going to survive, they needed answers, and fast. "Echo 7, he called out, addressing the ship's AI. "Analyze the vortex. Look for any recurring patterns or anomalies that might give us insight into its origin." The AI complied immediately, processing terabytes of data in seconds. Its response came moments later, accompanied by a series of complex visualizations projected onto the view screen. "Analysis incomplete," it reported. However, preliminary findings suggest the vortex exhibits properties consistent with theoretical models of interdimensional portals. Probability of artificial creation, 98.7%. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. They weren't dealing with a natural phenomenon. This was something built, something designed to bridge realities. Frost exchanged a glance with Riley, who looked as though she'd seen a ghost. "The legends were right," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Orion's gateway. It's real." Riley's fingers flew across her console as she attempted to triangulate their exact position relative to known space-time coordinates. The navigational data made no sense. According to her calculations, they occupied multiple locations simultaneously, existing in a state of quantum superposition between dimensions. "Captain," she called out, her voice trembling slightly, "the ancient texts were right. This isn't just a legend." Her display showed their ship trapped in what appeared to be a fold in space-time, caught between realities like a fly in amber. Behind her, the swirling vortex had begun to resolve into definite shapes, towering structures that defied physical laws, constructed from materials unknown to human science. Through gaps in the chaos, she caught glimpses of landscapes that shouldn't exist, populated by creatures that made her blood run cold. Each attempt to plot a course back to normal space resulted in more anomalies appearing on her screens. She pulled up additional overlays, comparing their current trajectory with historical records of missing ships and expeditions near Orion. The pattern was unmistakable. Dozens of vessels had vanished without a trace in this region over the centuries, their last known positions aligning perfectly with the boundaries of the vortex. "It's a trap," Riley said aloud, her voice hollow. "Every ship that came near here got pulled in, just like us." Her fingers trembled as she highlighted the data, connecting the dots between past disappearances and their present predicament. It wasn't coincidence, it was design. The vortex continued to evolve, its form becoming increasingly defined. What had started as a chaotic swirl of light and shadow now resembled an enormous gateway, arched like a cathedral door and inscribed with runes that pulsed with ominous energy. Beyond it, Riley could see fleeting images of alien worlds bathed in perpetual twilight, their skies streaked with colors that hurt to look at for too long. Towering monoliths rose from jagged terrain, their surfaces covered in the same glowing symbols that had invaded their ship. She zoomed in on one of the structures, her breath catching as she recognized familiar patterns. "These are the same glyphs we found in the engine room," she exclaimed, pointing at the screen. "They're part of the architecture of this place." Thomas joined her at the console, his expression grim. "So we're not just stuck in a random anomaly," he said, piecing together the implications. "This is a constructed environment, a pocket dimension designed to hold intruders." His eyes narrowed as he studied the runes. "And those symbols? They're instructions. Probably directions on how to escape, or maybe how to seal the gateway permanently." Frost stepped closer, his face etched with determination. "Translate them," he ordered. "If there's a way out, we need to find it before." His words were cut off as the ship lurched violently, throwing everyone off balance. Outside the viewport, the demon-like entities had grown bolder, pressing against the dimensional barrier with renewed ferocity. Their forms shifted constantly, blending solid matter with ethereal smoke, making it impossible to tell where one creature ended and another began. Some of them reached out with elongated limbs, their claws scraping against the invisible walls separating them from the ship. Riley fought to maintain focus, her mind racing as she tried to decipher the symbols. They weren't static. They changed depending on the angle of observation, revealing new layers of meaning with each adjustment. It was like solving a multidimensional puzzle, one that required not just intellect but intuition. "There's a sequence here," she murmured, tracing the patterns with her stylus. "If we can replicate it on our end, maybe we can disrupt the portal's stability." "But replicating it means interacting with whatever's powering the vortex," Thomas countered, his voice tinged with skepticism. "That's assuming we even have the tools to do it safely. One wrong move, and we could tear open the barrier completely." He glanced at the viewport, where the entities had begun to manifest more clearly, their grotesque features leering at the crew with predatory intent. "And then we're dead." Frost nodded, acknowledging the risks. "We don't have a choice," he said firmly. Either we figure this out, or we let those things into our reality. Neither option ends well for us. He turned back to Riley. Keep working on the translation. Thomas, start modifying the quantum drive to generate the necessary frequencies. We'll need every ounce of power we can muster if we're going to pull this off. As the crew sprang into action, the ship shuddered again, the vibrations rattling bones and loosening bolts. The air grew colder, filled with an oppressive weight that made breathing difficult. Shadows stretched unnaturally along the walls, twisting into shapes that mimicked the entities outside. Riley forced herself to concentrate, ignoring the creeping dread that gnawed at the edges of her consciousness. Each symbol she decoded brought them closer to understanding, but also closer to unleashing something far worse than they could imagine. Thomas worked feverishly in the engineering bay, his tools sparking as he attempted to modify their quantum drive to create a counter-frequency that might disrupt whatever force held them captive. Sweat poured down his face as he wrestled with technology never designed for such applications. The symbols carved into the walls had spread throughout the ship, now glowing with an intensity that made shadows dance wildly across every surface. These aren't random marks, he realized aloud, tracing their patterns. There's some kind of language, a warning perhaps? As he documented the symbols, his instruments detected minute changes in local gravity, creating pockets of intense pressure that threatened to crush sections of the ship. The air crackled with static electricity, making communications between crew members difficult and sometimes painful. Despite the growing danger, Thomas pressed on, driven by the knowledge that failure meant certain death for everyone aboard. The modifications required to the quantum drive were unprecedented, pushing the limits of both the ship's hardware and Thomas's expertise. He stripped away unnecessary components, rewiring the core to channel raw energy directly into the containment field generators. Sparks flew as he soldered new connections, his hands moving with practiced precision despite the chaos around him. The ship groaned under the strain, its metallic skeleton protesting the unnatural forces coursing through its veins. "Come on, hold together," he muttered, tightening a final bolt. "Just a little longer." Echo 7 chimed in periodically, offering updates on the ship's deteriorating condition. Structural integrity at 62%. Life support systems operating at reduced capacity. Recommend immediate evacuation protocols. Thomas ignored the AI's suggestions, knowing that abandoning ship wasn't an option. Even if they managed to escape in the escape pods, the entities outside would follow them, drawn to the life signatures like moths to flame. No, their only chance lay in finding a way to reverse whatever process had opened the portal in the first place. As he worked, the symbols on the walls began to pulse in sync with his efforts, reacting to the changes he was making to the ship's systems. It was as if the ship itself was alive, responding to his attempts to fight back. The thought sent a shiver down his spine, but he pushed it aside, focusing instead on the task at hand. He calibrated the quantum drive to emit a specific harmonic frequency, one that matched the patterns Riley had identified in the vortex. The theory was simple enough. If they could broadcast the correct sequence, they might be able to collapse the dimensional barrier and return to normal space. But executing the plan was another matter entirely. The drive's output was unstable, fluctuating wildly as it struggled to maintain coherence. Each surge of energy sent shockwaves through the ship, causing additional damage and drawing the entities closer. Thomas adjusted the settings repeatedly, fine-tuning the output until the fluctuation stabilized, at least temporarily. "This is going to take everything we've got," he muttered, running simulations on his tablet. "One shot, and if we miss..." He didn't finish the sentence. There was no point. Everyone on board knew the stakes. Failure meant annihilation for them, and possibly for countless others if the entities breached the barrier. Thomas double-checked his calculations, triple-checked the connections, and quadruple-checked the safety protocols. Then, taking a deep breath, he activated the modified drive. For a moment, nothing happened. The ship continued to shake, the vortex continued to swirl, and the entities continued to press against the barrier. Then, slowly, the symbols on the walls began to dim, their glow fading as the quantum drive absorbed their energy. The air cleared slightly, the oppressive weight lifting just enough for Thomas to breathe easier. "It's working," he whispered, his voice filled with cautious hope. "We might actually have a chance." But the reprieve was short-lived. The entities outside sensed the change, their forms coalescing into more solid shapes as they prepared to breach the weakening barrier. Thomas clenched his fists, knowing they were running out of time. The quantum drive was holding steady for now, but it wouldn't last forever. They needed to act quickly, before the entities overwhelmed them completely. Frost convened an emergency meeting in the observation lounge, where the situation became even more dire. Through the windows, they watched as the demon-like entities grew bolder, testing the boundaries of their dimensional prison. These beings radiated pure malice, their forms shifting between solid matter and ethereal smoke. Riley presented her findings. The legends spoke of a specific sequence of actions required to close the portal, but the details remained frustratingly vague. "There's mention of a key," she explained, "something called the Orion fragment that can seal the gateway." Thomas interrupted, pointing out that their ship's structural integrity was failing rapidly. Bulkheads groaned under impossible stresses, while life support systems fluctuated dangerously. Frost's mind raced through options, knowing they had limited time before either the ship collapsed or the entities found a way through. Every decision carried potentially fatal consequences. The observation lounge was eerily quiet, save for the faint hum of the ship's failing systems and the distant sound of metal creaking under unimaginable strain. Frost stood at the head of the table, his eyes scanning the faces of his crew. Riley looked pale but resolute, her hands gripping the edge of the table as though bracing herself for impact. Thomas, meanwhile, was hunched over his tablet, muttering calculations under his breath. Both of them bore the weight of exhaustion, their bodies pushed to the limit by days of relentless effort. Yet neither showed signs of giving up. "The Orion fragment," Frost repeated, rolling the phrase around in his mind. "Do we have any idea what that means? Is it physical? Symbolic? Technological?" Riley shook her head, frustration evident in her expression. "The texts are inconsistent. Some describe it as an artifact, others as a frequency, and still others as a concept, a state of being or alignment." She tapped her fingers nervously on the table. "What's clear is that it's central to sealing the portal. Without it, we're stuck here indefinitely." Thomas leaned forward, placing his tablet on the table. "Assuming we can even figure out what the fragment is, how do we use it? Our ship's already falling apart. Even if we manage to stabilize the quantum drive long enough to generate the necessary frequencies, there's no guarantee it'll work. And if it doesn't," he trailed off, letting the implication hang in the air. If their attempt failed, they risked not only their own destruction but also the complete collapse of the dimensional barrier, allowing the entities unrestricted access to their reality. Frost nodded grimly. "Then we'll need to prioritize. Riley, focus on narrowing down the possibilities for the Orion fragment. Look for anything that overlaps between the different interpretations. Thomas, continue fine-tuning the quantum drive. We need every advantage we can get when the time comes." He paused, his gaze drifting to the viewport, where the entities were massing in greater numbers. Their forms had grown more cohesive, their movements synchronized as if guided by a single intelligence. "And we'll need to prepare for the worst-case scenario. If the barrier fails, we'll need a contingency plan." Riley swallowed hard, her eyes darting between Frost and the viewport. "What kind of contingency plan?" she asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. Frost met her gaze squarely. "Evacuation pods. If it comes to that, we'll jettison the pods and hope the entities focus on the ship instead of us. It's a slim chance, but it's better than nothing." The room fell silent as the weight of his words settled over them. Evacuation pods were a last resort, a desperate gamble against overwhelming odds. Even if they survived the initial launch, they'd be adrift in an alien dimension with no way to navigate or communicate. Death might come quickly, or it might drag on indefinitely, a slow descent into madness. Yet despite the bleakness of the situation, none of them voiced objections. They were professionals, trained to face adversity with courage and determination. If survival required sacrifice, they would rise to the challenge. Frost straightened, his voice firm. Let's get to work. Time's running out, and we've got a galaxy to save. With that, he dismissed the meeting, watching as Riley and Thomas returned to their stations. Alone in the observation lounge, he allowed himself a moment to reflect. The weight of leadership pressed heavily on his shoulders, but he refused to falter. Whatever awaited them beyond the portal, they would face it together, as a crew, as a team, as survivors. As the crisis deepened, personal tensions among the crew surfaced. Riley accused Thomas of focusing too much on theoretical solutions while practical problems mounted. Thomas shot back that her reliance on ancient texts might be leading them further into danger. Frost intervened, forcing them to work together despite their differences. Their arguments revealed crucial insights. Combining Riley's historical knowledge with Thomas's technical expertise created new possibilities. The symbols spreading through the ship weren't just warnings. They formed a map of sorts, showing potential weak points in the dimensional barrier. Meanwhile, the demon creatures demonstrated increasing intelligence, coordinating their attacks and targeting specific systems. Frost observed that their behavior suggested awareness of the humans' attempts to escape, implying they were being actively hunted across dimensions. The tension reached a boiling point during a particularly heated exchange in the engineering bay. Riley stormed in, clutching a datapad filled with hastily scribbled notes. "You're wasting time tinkering with the quantum drive when we should be decoding these symbols," she snapped, gesturing at the glowing glyphs covering the walls. "They're the key to understanding what's happening to us." Thomas barely glanced up from his workbench, where he was recalibrating a critical component. "And what good is decoding them if we don't have the means to act on that information?" he retorted, his voice sharp with frustration. "Even if you figure out the sequence, we still need the power to execute it, which is exactly what I'm trying to provide." Frost arrived just in time to prevent the argument from escalating further. "Enough," he barked, stepping between them. "We don't have the luxury of division right now. If you two can't work together, we're all dead. So start acting like professionals, or I'll relieve both of you of duty." His words hit home, silencing the pair. Riley flushed with embarrassment, while Thomas looked chastened but defiant. Frost softened his tone slightly. "Look, I know this is stressful. We're all operating on minimal sleep and maximum adrenaline. But arguing won't solve anything. What will solve something is combining your strengths." Reluctantly, Riley and Thomas agreed to collaborate, albeit with visible reluctance. They set up a joint workstation in the engineering bay, pooling their resources and expertise. Riley focused on interpreting the symbols, using Thomas's technical knowledge to refine her translations. Together, they began to uncover patterns that neither had noticed individually. The symbols weren't just warnings or instructions, they were markers, indicating specific points of vulnerability in the dimensional barrier. By mapping these points, they could target their efforts more effectively, conserving precious energy and resources. Meanwhile, the entities outside grew more aggressive, their coordinated attacks suggesting a level of intelligence that bordered on strategic. They targeted critical systems with surgical precision, disabling weapons arrays, disrupting communication links, and sabotaging life support. Frost noted how their movements mirrored the crew's activities, as though they were anticipating every move. "They're learning," he remarked during a status update, "adapting to our strategies. We'll need to stay one step ahead if we want to survive." To combat this, Frost implemented a rotating schedule, ensuring that at least one crew member remained awake and vigilant at all times. He also established a series of decoy operations, intentionally leaking false data to mislead the entities. While risky, the tactic bought them valuable time, allowing Riley and Thomas to make significant progress in their collaborative efforts. Slowly but surely, they began piecing together a comprehensive plan, one that combined ancient wisdom with cutting-edge technology. Despite their strained relationship, Riley and Thomas found common ground in their shared determination to succeed. Late-night conversations turned into brainstorming sessions, their initial hostility giving way to mutual respect. They discovered that their differing perspectives complemented each other, creating a synergy neither had expected. Riley's intuitive grasp of symbolism balanced Thomas's methodical approach to engineering, resulting in innovative solutions neither could have devised alone. As they worked side by side, the crew dynamic shifted. The earlier animosity transformed into camaraderie, forged in the crucible of adversity. Frost watched with quiet satisfaction, knowing that their unity was their greatest strength. Together, they stood a fighting chance against the horrors arrayed against them. A breakthrough came when Riley discovered a hidden pattern in the ancient symbols matching certain constellations visible through the vortex. Working with Thomas, they theorized these corresponded to specific energy frequencies that maintained the dimensional lock. Using modified sensor arrays, they began mapping these frequencies while monitoring the demon's reactions. The creatures responded violently to certain wavelengths, retreating momentarily before pressing forward again. "We're onto something," Thomas declared, adjusting their equipment. Frost coordinated their efforts from the bridge, using tactical displays to track both the frequency patterns and the entity's movements. The ship shook violently as they experimented with different combinations, each attempt bringing them closer to understanding but also increasing the risk of catastrophic failure. Time was running out as structural damage accumulated faster than they could repair it. The breakthrough came unexpectedly, almost accidentally. Riley had been cross-referencing the symbols with the positions of nearby stars when she noticed a correlation between certain glyph sequences and the electromagnetic emissions of specific constellations. "Wait a second," she murmured, zooming in on the data. "These patterns, they're not random. They're mapping the energy fields around us." She highlighted several clusters of symbols, overlaying them with real-time sensor readings. The results were startling. Each cluster corresponded to a distinct frequency band, one that resonated with the dimensional barrier. Thomas joined her at the console, his eyes widening as he processed the implications. "If we can isolate those frequencies and amplify them, we might be able to disrupt the barrier's stability," he said, excitement creeping into his voice. "But it's going to require precise calibration. Too much power, and we risk tearing the barrier apart completely. Too little, and nothing happens." Frost listened intently, his mind racing through the possibilities. "Can we test it on a smaller scale first?" he asked. "Something controlled, to gauge the effect." Riley nodded, already pulling up simulation software. "We can use the containment field generator in engineering as a test bed. If we adjust its output to match the frequencies, we should be able to observe the interaction without risking the entire ship." The team moved quickly, setting up the experiment in the engineering bay. Thomas modified the containment field generator, programming it to emit bursts of energy at varying intensities. Riley monitored the results, correlating the generator's output with changes in the dimensional barrier. At first, there was no noticeable effect. Then, as they increased the amplitude, something remarkable happened. The glowing symbols on the walls began to fade, their luminescence dimming as the frequency waves rippled through the ship. The air, previously thick with oppressive energy, seemed to lighten, and for a brief moment, the vortex outside appeared to waver, its swirling chaos momentarily disrupted. "We're onto something," Thomas repeated, his voice tinged with cautious optimism. "But we need to scale this up if we want to affect the entire barrier." He glanced at Riley, who was already adjusting the parameters on her console. "The containment field generator is powerful, but it's not designed to handle the kind of output we'd need to collapse the portal. We'll have to channel the energy directly through the quantum drive." Frost crossed his arms, his expression grim but resolute. "Do it," he said without hesitation. "But we need to be ready for anything. If this works, we might trigger a chain reaction that could either save us or destroy everything." His words hung in the air, a stark reminder of the stakes they were facing. There would be no second chances. Riley and Thomas exchanged a glance, their earlier tensions replaced by a shared determination. They knew what was at risk, but they also understood that this was their best, and perhaps only shot at survival. Working side by side, they began rerouting power from auxiliary systems to the quantum drive, carefully calibrating its output to match the frequencies they had identified. The process was painstaking, requiring absolute precision. One miscalculation could destabilize the drive entirely, leading to catastrophic failure. As they worked, the entities outside grew more agitated, their forms writhing violently against the weakening barrier. Their glowing eyes locked onto the ship, and their movements became increasingly erratic, as though they sensed the crew's intentions. Frost watched them from the bridge, his jaw tightening as he observed their behavior. "They know what we're doing," he muttered under his breath. "And they're not happy about it." The ship groaned under the strain, its hull creaking as the dimensional forces intensified. Sparks flew from overloaded circuits, and emergency alarms blared incessantly, adding to the chaos. Despite the mounting pressure, Riley and Thomas remained focused, their hands moving swiftly over their respective consoles. They were close, so close, to unlocking the solution. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the quantum drive was ready. Riley double-checked the frequency settings one last time, her heart pounding in her chest. "We're as prepared as we'll ever be," she said, turning to Frost. "Captain, it's now or never." Frost nodded, his gaze steady. "Proceed," he ordered. "Let's finish this." Their breakthrough came unexpectedly during a particularly violent assault by the entities. As Riley fought to maintain navigational control, her console displayed a brief window of stability in the dimensional field. Thomas seized the opportunity, channeling all remaining power into their modified quantum drive while manipulating the frequency patterns they'd mapped. For a moment, everything aligned perfectly. The ship's systems synchronized with the natural resonance of space-time, creating a temporary bubble of normalcy. Outside, the demon creatures recoiled as if burned, their forms dissolving temporarily. "We need to amplify this effect," Frost ordered, realizing they'd stumbled upon the key to closing the portal. Working quickly, they adapted their equipment to sustain and expand this protective field while searching for a way to reverse the process that had opened the gateway in the first place. The ship vibrated with raw energy as they pushed their technology far beyond safe operating parameters. The initial success was fleeting but exhilarating. As the quantum drive emitted the calibrated frequencies, the vortex outside shrank slightly, its chaotic swirls slowing to a sluggish spin. The shadowy entities, which had been pressing relentlessly against the barrier, retreated with eerie shrieks that echoed through the ship's hull. For the first time since their ordeal began, there was a glimmer of hope, a tangible sense that they might actually succeed. But maintaining the effect proved far more challenging than creating it. The quantum drive, already operating at dangerous levels, began overheating almost immediately. Warning lights flashed across the engineering bay, and the temperature rose sharply, forcing Thomas to work amid streams of sweat pouring down his face. "I can't keep this up for long," he shouted, his voice strained as he adjusted the cooling systems. "We need to find a way to stabilize the output." Riley scrambled to assist, rerouting additional power from non-essential systems to reinforce the drive. Her fingers flew over her console, inputting commands with lightning speed. "If we can synchronize the drive's output with the ship's structural harmonics, we might be able to create a feedback loop that sustains itself," she suggested, her mind racing through possibilities. "It's risky, but it could buy us enough time to fully collapse the barrier." Frost, standing nearby, made a snap decision. "Do it," he commanded. "We've got nothing to lose at this point." He turned to Echo 7, the ship's AI, issuing rapid-fire instructions. "Divert every available resource to support the quantum drive. Shut down life support in non-critical areas if you have to. We need every joule of energy we can get." The AI complied instantly, rerouting power with mechanical efficiency. Lights flickered and dimmed throughout the ship as auxiliary systems went offline, plunging corridors into near darkness. The hum of the ship's engines grew louder, vibrating through the floor and walls as the quantum drive pushed beyond its limits. Outside the viewport, the vortex continued to shrink, its edges fraying like torn fabric. The entities, once so menacing and relentless, now flailed helplessly, their forms dissolving into wisps of smoke before reforming in distant reaches of the dimensional space. Yet even as the crew celebrated their progress, new challenges emerged. The ship's structural integrity plummeted dangerously low, with stress fractures spreading across critical sections of the hull. Bulkheads groaned under the strain, and loose equipment tumbled through the corridors as artificial gravity fluctuated wildly. Thomas cursed under his breath, fighting to keep the quantum drive stable while addressing the cascade of failures threatening to tear the ship apart. "Captain, we're losing structural cohesion," Riley warned, her voice rising in panic. "If we don't stabilize soon, the ship won't hold together long enough to complete the sequence." Frost clenched his fists, his mind racing through options. Every instinct screamed at him to abort the operation and focus on survival, but he knew that abandoning the attempt now would doom not only their crew but potentially countless others. The entities were intelligent, they wouldn't give up easily. If they escaped into normal space, the consequences would be unimaginable. "Keep going," he said firmly, his voice cutting through the chaos. "We've come too far to stop now. Riley, monitor the structural integrity and prioritize repairs where possible. Thomas, keep the drive running no matter what. I'll handle damage control on the bridge." With that, he sprinted toward the ladder leading to the upper deck, leaving Riley and Thomas to execute the final stages of their plan. The team pushed themselves to their limits, working in shifts around the clock. Sleep deprivation took its toll, manifesting in hallucinations that blurred the line between reality and nightmare. Riley saw shadowy figures moving in her peripheral vision, while Thomas heard whispers and languages he didn't recognize. Frost maintained outward calm, though his hands trembled slightly when giving orders. Their research uncovered disturbing connections between similar events throughout history: ships lost near Orion, colonies abandoned, entire expeditions vanished without trace. The pattern suggested these occurrences happened cyclically, coinciding with specific astronomical alignments. As they delved deeper, they realized their current predicament wasn't random. Something had drawn them here deliberately. The ancient beacon they'd activated served as both trap and test, designed to challenge those who dared approach the forbidden knowledge of the stars. Sleep became a luxury none of them could afford. Riley's dreams, when she managed to snatch moments of rest, were haunted by visions of the entities pressing closer, their glowing eyes piercing through the darkness. She woke repeatedly, drenched in sweat, convinced that cold fingers were brushing against her skin. Each time, she forced herself back to work, knowing that stopping meant failure, and failure meant death. Thomas fared little better. The constant hum of the quantum drive merged with the voices in his head, whispering fragments of equations and warnings in tongues he couldn't identify. He tried to ignore them, focusing instead on the task at hand, but the exhaustion made it harder to distinguish reality from illusion. At one point, he swore he saw Riley's reflection in a darkened viewport morph into one of the shadowy creatures, its elongated limbs reaching out toward him. He blinked, shaking his head, and the image vanished, but the unease lingered. Frost bore the weight of leadership heavily, his usual stoicism cracking under the strain. He paced the bridge endlessly, issuing orders and monitoring the ship's deteriorating condition. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted controls, and his voice carried a faint edge of desperation. Yet he refused to show weakness, knowing that the crew looked to him for strength. In quieter moments, he allowed himself to reflect on the broader implications of their discovery. The cyclical nature of the disappearances near Orion suggested that whatever force controlled the gateway operated on a grander scale than they had imagined. Perhaps it wasn't merely a trap, but a mechanism, a device designed to filter out the unworthy and preserve the secrets of the universe. As they dug deeper into the data, patterns emerged that confirmed their suspicions. Historical records showed that the disappearances occurred roughly every 237 years, aligning with specific conjunctions of planets and stars within Orion's constellation. Ancient civilizations had marked these periods with rituals and sacrifices, believing them to be times of great cosmic significance. Modern science dismissed such practices as superstition, but the evidence suggested otherwise. Something, or someone, was orchestrating these events, using the beacon as a lure to draw curious explorers into the fold. The realization hit Frost like a physical blow. They weren't just victims of circumstance, they had been chosen. The activation of the beacon hadn't been accidental, it had been inevitable. Whatever intelligence controlled the gateway had anticipated their arrival, testing their resolve and ingenuity. And now, as they fought to survive, they were proving themselves worthy, or unworthy, of escaping its grasp. As they refined their approach, the true nature of their enemy became clearer. The entities weren't merely mindless predators, but intelligent manifestations of pure chaos, feeding on fear and doubt. They began targeting the crew's psychological weaknesses, projecting illusions tailored to each individual's deepest fears. Riley saw visions of her family dying horribly, while Thomas relived moments of professional failure that haunted him. Frost confronted specters of past missions gone wrong, faces of those he couldn't save staring accusingly at him. Through sheer willpower, they fought back against these mental assaults, supporting each other through shared strength. The experience forged an unbreakable bond between them, transforming their initial conflicts into a unified front against the encroaching darkness. Each victory against their inner demons strengthened their ability to combat the external threat. Riley's worst fears manifested in vivid detail. She found herself standing in her childhood home, watching helplessly as fire consumed the building with her loved ones trapped inside. The heat was unbearable, the screams deafening. She reached out, desperate to save them, but her hands passed through the flames as though they weren't real. It was only when she heard Frost's voice calling her name that she snapped back to reality, gasping for air as tears streamed down her face. "Don't let them win," Frost urged, gripping her shoulder firmly. "They feed on your fear. Fight back." Thomas faced his own torment in the form of a recurring memory, the day he failed to prevent a catastrophic engine malfunction aboard a previous ship. The explosion had claimed dozens of lives, and the guilt had haunted him ever since. Now, the scene replayed in excruciating detail, the screams of the dying echoing in his ears. He clenched his fists, forcing himself to confront the truth. "I did everything I could," he whispered, his voice trembling. "I'm not that man anymore." With effort, he banished the vision, returning to the present with renewed determination. Even Frost, whose years of experience had taught him to suppress his emotions, found himself tested. The faces of those he had failed stared back at him, their accusations cutting deeper than any blade. "You left us behind," they whispered, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of despair. Frost closed his eyes, drawing on every ounce of discipline he possessed. "I carry your memories with me," he replied softly, "but I won't let them define me. Not anymore." Through these trials, the crew grew stronger, their bonds deepening as they supported one another through the darkest moments. They learned to recognize the illusions for what they were, projections of their own doubts and insecurities, and to confront them head-on. Each victory bolstered their confidence, reinforcing their belief that they could overcome not only the external threat, but also the internal battles they faced. By the time the final phase of their plan approached, they were no longer individuals struggling alone, but a cohesive unit united by shared purpose. The entities still pressed against the barrier, their forms shifting and twisting with malevolent intent, but the crew stood ready to face them. Together, they had forged a resilience that transcended fear, a strength born of unity and trust. The final pieces fell into place when Riley deciphered a crucial section of the ancient texts. The Orion fragment wasn't a physical object, but a specific harmonic frequency pattern that could collapse the dimensional barrier. Working with Thomas, they developed a method to broadcast this pattern using their ship's communication array. However, implementing this solution required them to position the vessel precisely at the nexus point of the vortex, the most dangerous location possible. Frost calculated their approach carefully, using every trick he'd learned in decades of space combat. As they maneuvered into position, the demon entities launched their most ferocious attack yet, battering the ship with waves of chaotic energy. Systems failed left and right, forcing Thomas to make desperate repairs while Riley maintained their precarious position. The fate of countless worlds depended on their success. Positioning the ship at the nexus point was akin to threading a needle while blindfolded. The vortex pulsed erratically, its gravitational pull threatening to tear the ship apart at any moment. Frost guided the vessel with meticulous precision, his hands steady despite the chaos unfolding around him. "Steady, steady," he muttered under his breath, his eyes glued to the tactical display. Riley monitored their alignment, calling out corrections as needed. "Portside thrusters at 45%, starboard at 60%, she instructed, her voice tense but controlled. "We're almost there." Thomas, meanwhile, battled a cascade of system failures in engineering. Power surges knocked out critical components, forcing him to improvise repairs with whatever tools he could find. Sparks flew as he welded a damaged conduit, his movements frantic but precise. "Come on, hold together," he growled, slamming his fist against a stubborn panel that refused to respond. Behind him, the glowing symbols on the walls pulsed brighter, reacting to the ship's proximity to the vortex's core. As they reached the nexus point, the entities redoubled their efforts, swarming the ship with renewed ferocity. Their forms coalesced into massive, grotesque shapes, hammering against the barrier with enough force to shake the entire vessel. Frost gritted his teeth, fighting to maintain control as alarms blared and warning lights flashed across the bridge. "We're in position," he announced, his voice cutting through the din. "Initiate the broadcast sequence." Riley activated the communication array, channeling the harmonic frequency pattern into a concentrated beam aimed directly at the vortex's center. The ship vibrated violently as the energy surged through its systems, pushing every component to its absolute limit. Outside, the vortex reacted instantly, its swirling chaos intensifying as the harmonic frequencies clashed with its structure. The entities screamed in rage, their forms dissolving into tendrils of smoke before reforming in a frenzied attempt to breach the barrier. "Hold steady," Frost shouted, his voice hoarse from exertion. "We're breaking through." With seconds to spare, they activated the harmonic broadcast. The ship's systems overloaded spectacularly, every instrument panel erupting in sparks and flames. Outside, the vortex contorted violently as the dimensional barrier began to collapse. The demon creatures screamed in rage and terror as their connection to this reality severed. Riley fought to maintain consciousness, her hands locked on the controls as the gravitational stresses threatened to tear the ship apart. Thomas scrambled to contain the cascading system's failures, sacrificing non-essential components to keep life support functioning. Frost coordinated their efforts through the chaos, his voice steady despite the maelstrom surrounding them. Slowly, agonizingly, the swirling energies began to subside, the impossible geometries fading back into familiar star patterns. One by one, the entity manifestations winked out of existence, their hold on this dimension broken. The collapse of the vortex was both beautiful and terrifying. Colors danced across the viewport in a kaleidoscope of light, blending and separating in ways that defied comprehension. The ship shook violently, its hull groaning under the immense forces unleashed by the collapsing barrier. Sparks rained down from overhead panels, and the air grew thick with smoke as overloaded circuits shorted out. Yet through it all, the crew held fast, their determination unwavering. Riley slumped against her console, her body trembling with exhaustion but her eyes fixed on the viewport. The vortex shrank rapidly, its swirling chaos condensing into a single, brilliant point of light. Then, with a final, ear-splitting roar, it vanished entirely, leaving only the serene expanse of stars behind. Silence fell over the ship, broken only by the occasional crackle of dying electronics. Thomas staggered into the bridge, his face streaked with soot and sweat. "It's done," he rasped, leaning heavily against the wall. "The barrier's gone." His voice carried a mixture of relief and disbelief, as though he couldn't quite believe they had succeeded. Frost allowed himself a rare smile, the tension finally easing from his shoulders. "Good work, everyone," he said, his voice filled with quiet pride. "You saved us all." He turned to the viewport, gazing at the stars that now seemed impossibly bright. "Let's get home." When silence finally returned to the ship, the survivors sat in stunned exhaustion, watching as normal space reasserted itself around them. Emergency beacons automatically transmitted their status to Fleet Command while diagnostic systems ran constant checks on their battered vessel. Though physically intact, each crew member bore invisible scars from their ordeal. The experience had fundamentally changed them, leaving them with profound questions about the nature of reality and humanity's place in the universe. As they set course for home, Frost made careful notes in his log, ensuring future generations would know the truth about Orion's gateway. The official report would require careful wording. Some mysteries needed to remain partially hidden. Remember, he told his crew as they prepared to enter cryosleep for the journey back, some doors are meant to stay closed. The camera pans out, showing their damaged ship limping through the stars, then fades to black with the text, "What other ancient secrets lie waiting among the stars?" Subscribe to uncover more untold stories of space exploration.